Everyone deserves access to healthy food, but not everyone can get to a food.
Unearthly humps of land curved into the darkening sky like the backs of browsing pigs, like the rumps of elephants. At night when the stars rose over them they looked like a starlit herd of divine pigs. The villagers called them hullocks. The valleys were full of soft and wind-blown vegetation. The sea rolled at the foot of all as though God had brought his herd down to water. The hullocks were blackening as Velvet cantered down the chalk road to the village. She ran on her own slender legs, making hoarse noises and chirrups and occasionally striking her thigh with a switch, holding at the same time something very small before her as she ran. The light on the chalk road was the last thing to gleam and die. The flint slipped and flashed under her feet. Her cotton dress and her cottony hair blew out, and her lips were parted for breath in a sweet metallic smile. She had the look of a sapling Dante as she ran through the darkness downhill. At the entrance to the village, the sea was pounding up the Suir with a spring gale behind it. She passed to the third cottage, stopped at the door, opened it, let a gush of light onto the pavement, closed it and carried her tender object inside. Edwina, Malvalia, and Meredith sat in their father's Mr. Brown's sitting room just before supper time. It was dark outside and hot inside, and outside in the darkness the hullocks went up in great hoops above the 2. National Velvet Village. There was an oil stove in the corner of the sitting room and lesson books on the table. The ceiling was low and sagged. An Albert lamp with a green glass shade lit the table. There was no electric light. Donald, the boy of 4, was asleep upstairs. Edwina, Malvalia and Meredith were all exactly alike, like golden greyhounds. Their golden hair was sleek, their fine faces like antelopes, their shoulders still and steady like Zulu women carrying water, and their bodies beneath the shoulders rippled when they moved. They were 17, 16, and 15. Velvet was 14. Velvet had short pale hair, large, protruding teeth, a sweet smile and a mouth full of metal. Mr. Brown was swilling down the slaughterhouse, as Me Taylor was away for the day. The sound of the hose swished at the wooden partition which separated the slaughterhouse from the sitting room. "He went beautifully," said Velvet, and laying down a tiny paper horse on the table she wrenched at the gold band that bound her teeth back and laid it beside the horse. "Father'll be in a minute," said Edwina waningly. "It's going in again directly I hear a sound," said Velvet, and sitting down she swept the plate into her lap. "Look at him," she said lovingly, taking up the paper horse. "I must unsaddle him and rub him down." The heads were bent on the lesson books again, and Velvet took a tiny bridle of cotton threads from the horse. Then going to a shell box on the sideboard she brought it to the table. "It's just supper," said Mally. "You all have to clear." Velvet opened the box and took out a stable rubber. National Velvet dollar. 2 inches square, a portion of her handkerchief, hemmed round. Laying the little horse flat on the table she rubbed him with delicacy in circular motions, after having taken a paper saddle from his back. The horse was a racer cut from the bystander. He stood 3 inches high and had a raking neck and a keen, veined face. By dint of much rubbing the paper had given off a kind of coat, and now as Velvet rubbed there came a suede-like sheen on the horse's paper body. He was dark, most carefully cut out, and pasted upon cardboard. The bridle was made by the fingers of a fairy, noseband, chin strap and all, in black cotton. "He has a high action," said Velvet. "A lovely show canter, but a difficult trot. I didn't jump him today as he needs to settle down." In the shell box other horses lay. "There's a marvelous picture of mares on the back of the Times today, but you can't cut a single one clear. They're all mixed up with the foals." "I saw it," said Velvet. "I called at the post office. But it was no good." "I called in too," said Mally. "They said in the post office that one of us looking at the Times was enough. We'd better take turns." "Yes," said Velvet. "You can't think how lovely it was galloping up there. It was nearly dark. He never put a foot wrong. Somehow you can trust a horse like that." "IP's blood that counts," said Mally darkly. "I haven't got the racing saddle cut right," went on Velvet. "I wish I could find a picture of one. I ride short when I ride this horse, and with this saddle the knees come right off onto his shoulder." "For National Velvet." "You need knee flaps," said Edwina. "I suppose there's not time," said Velvet, "to take the chestnut down for a stand in the pond. His hocks are still puffy." "It's not you to lay tonight," said Mally. "You've got 10 minutes. Don't let father see. Mind your plate. It's fallen." Velvet dived under the table, picked it up, and examined it anxiously. Opening her mouth she worked it painfully in with both hands. "Spent a bit," she gasped. "It's a hell plate. It's no good. Don't go on. Get on down to the pond." Velvet packed the racer in the shell box and carefully abstracted a smaller horse, a colored picture of a polo pony cut from the Tatler. Putting the box away she slipped through the door with the chestnut and was gone. A door at the other end of the sitting room opened and Mrs. Brown came in. She stood and looked at the daughters for a moment, an enormous woman who had once swum the channel. Now she had become muscle-bound. Towering over the Albert lamp, she threw her shadow across the books and up the wall. She said, "Lay supper," and went out. "Meredith," said Edwina mechanically without looking up. Meredith got up and began to collect the books. When all the books were gone, the two sisters sat tilting their chairs back so that Meredith could get the white doth over the edge of the table past their knees. When this was done, all their chairs came forward again. Kneeling by the Victorian sideboard, Meredith pulled out National Velvet J. Plates, bread knife, platter, sugar, knives and forks and salts and peppers. The street door opened and Velvet stood on the mat. She had her shoes in her hand and her bare ankles were green with slime. Mrs. Brown, who had come in, glanced at her and took a duster from the sideboard. "Wipe them up," she said, and threw the duster onto the mat. Velvet mopped her slimy ankles, whispering to Mally, pointing with her finger towards the door, "Stars like Christmas trees. Terrible stuff in the pond. Spawn." I stood 5 minutes. "We ought to get some," said Mally. "Till get a bottle after supper." "Any spawn," said Mrs. Brown without looking up, "goes on a tin tray." "Yes, mother." "Larder," said Mrs. Brown. Velvet put her shoes in the corner and the horse in the shell box and disappeared. The others sat in silence till she came back with the tray. Cold ham, jam, butter were placed on the table, and a dish of radishes. Mr. Brown came in by the slaughterhouse door, gumboots drawn to his thighs, his sleeves rolled up, his hands wet from the hose. He passed through the room on his way to wash for supper. Velvet and the 3 golden greyhounds sat on in brooding silence. A smell of liver and bacon stole in from the kitchen. The 2 doors, that on the street and that on the kitchen, opened suddenly together. Out of the black hole of the street came Me Taylor, brushed up for supper. Mrs. Brown came in from the kitchen carrying the liver and bacon. 6 National Velvet. Hash. The room filled with smells. Mr. Brown came in putting on his coat. Everyone sat down, Mr. last of all, pulling up his chair gingerly. "Well," said Mr. Brown, and helped the liver round. Meredith went out and fetched in the jugs of coffee and milk. "Been over to Worthing," said Mr. Brown. "I have," said me. "Got that freezing machine catalogue for me. Shop's shut again." "Good God," said Mr. Brown exasperated, "don't you ever learn the shut shop day in Worthing?" "What'd I do then?" "Had 3 teeth out. Dentist was all there was open." "Oh me, where?" said Velvet. Me opened his jaw and pointed to a bloody wound. "Oughta eat pap for it," said Mr. Brown. "It's pulpy." "Es got to learn to harden," said me. "Donald asleep," said Mally. "This hour gone," said Mrs. Brown. They ate, sleek girls' heads bent under the lamp, Mr. Brown and Mrs. Brown square and full and steady. Me silent and dexterous with his red hair boiling up in curls on his skull. Jacob went grinning round the table, from sister to sister. "Nobody feeds him," ordered me under his breath. His red hair boiled up on his skull fiercer than ever at Jacob's presumption. The yard spaniels remained in the street on the door. National Velvet 7. Step through meals. They lay and leant against the front door, grouped on the step, so that the door creaked and groaned under their pressed bodies. When the door was opened from the inside, they fell in. When this happened, me sent them out again with a roar. Jacob had been allowed in all his life. His fox terrier body, growing stout in middle age, still vibrated to a look. His lips curled and he grinned at the blink of a human eyelash. His tail ached with wagging, and even his hips waggled as he moved. But under cover of these virtues he was watchful for his benefit, watchful for human weakness, affected, a ready liar, disobedient, boastful, a sucker-up, and had a lifelong battle with me. Me adored him and seldom said a kind word to him. Jacob adored me, and there was no one whom he would not sooner deceive. At meals Jacob wriggled and grinned from sister to sister, making a circle round me, whose leg was scooping for him. Just outside the slaughterhouse was a black barking dog on the end of a string. This dog had a name but no character. It barked without ceasing day and night. Nobody heard it. The Brown slept and lived and ate beside its barking. The spaniels never opened their mouths. They pressed against doors and knee and furniture. They lived for love and never got it. They were herded indiscriminately together and none knew their characteristics but me. The sisters felt for them what they felt for the fowls in the fowl yard. Me fed them. But Jacob's weaknesses and affectations and dubious sincerities were thrust upon everyone's notice. When Velvet came in at the front door, and pressing back the leaning spaniels, dosed it, Jacob would rise, wriggle his hips at her, bow and grin. Oh. 8 National Velvet. How exquisite, how condescending, how flattering, said he, bowing lower and lower, with his front legs slid out on the floor and his back legs stiff. But if asked to go for a walk, not a step would he come outside unless he had business of his own with the ash bin, or wanted to taunt the chained and raging dog with the spine of a herring dragged in the dust. The chained dog chiefly barked. But sometimes he stopped rending the unheeding air and lay silent. Then he would whirl out on his chain like a fury and fall flat, half choked. And Jacob would stand without flinching, banking on the strength of the chain, and think, "You poor one-thoughted fool." The Browns loved Jacob as they loved each other, deeply, from the back of the soul, with intolerance in daily life. As the girls ate, a private dream floated in Velvet's mind. It was a little horse, slender and perfect, rising divinely at a jump, 4 feet tucked up neatly, intelligence and delight in its eager eye, and on its back, glued lightly and easily to the saddle. She. Velvet. Gymkhana Velvet. As she took the visionary jump, her living hand stole to her mouth. She pulled out the torturing plate and hid it in her lap. Me's eyes were on her in a flash, he who never missed anything. "Be windy for the fair Thursday," said Mrs. Brown. "It's coming in wild from the southwest," said Mr. Brown. "Always does when it comes in at all," said Mrs. Brown. 3-day gale. All the trees in the dark village outside attested this. They were blown like fans set on one side. The rooks shuffled and slept in them, waving up and down among. National Velvet 9. The breaking twigs. The village street was white with milk droppings. "Tug that in again," Velvet commanded Mrs. Brown. "She got it out again?" asked Mr. Brown, looking up sharply. "It aches me and aches when I eat," said Velvet. "Ache or no, argue or no, that plate cost me £4.10 and it's solid gold and asterisk it goes in," said Mr. Brown. "I'm not going to have a child like a rabbit if I can help it. You girls have got your faces for your fortunes and none other. FVE told you often enough." The 3 golden greyhounds sat up straighter than ever and Velvet fumbled with her teeth. "It's not hooked up." "Unhook it, then," said Mr. Brown. He sat back, satisfied, commanding and comfortable, and pulled the radishes towards him. Then he passed the dish round. "Take a radish." Velvet couldn't bite a radish /. "Go without then," said Mr. Brown happily, and leant back to light his pipe. All the Browns tilted their chairs. Nobody ever told them it would hurt the carpet. They ate, ruminated, and tilted. Only Mrs. Brown sat solid and silent. She did not talk much, but managed the till down at the shop in the street. She knew all about courage and endurance, to the last ounce of strength, from the first swallow of overcome timidity. She valued and appraised each daughter, she knew what each daughter could do. She was glad too that her daughters were not boys, because she could not understand the courage of men, but only the courage of women. Mr. Brown was with dignity the head of the family. But Mrs. Brown was the standard of I.O. National Velvet. The family. When Velvet had fallen off the pier at the age of 6, her mother went in 30 feet after her, 16 stone, royal blue afternoon dress. A straight dive, like the dive of an aging mammoth. The reporter from the West Worthing News came to make a story of it and said to Edwina, "Your mother swam the channel, didn't she?" Edwina nodded towards her mother. "Better ask her what's past's past, young man," said Mrs. Brown heavily, and shut her mouth and her door. Me Taylor's father had trained Mrs. Brown for her swim, trained her when she had been a great girl of 19, necklace, clumsy, and incredibly enduring. Me himself had been a flyweight boxer, killed his man, because the wretched creature was in status lymphaticus, got exonerated and yet somehow disqualified, tramped the country, held horses, cleaned stables and drifted nearer and nearer to the racing world, till he knew all about it except the feel of a horse's back. Arriving somehow in the ebb of Lewis races, he had been taken on by Mr. Brown for the slaughterhouse, for running errands, and lately even for negotiating for stock. Mrs. Brown stared at him when he came with a look of strange pleasure in her hooded eyes. Me Taylor, the son of Father Taylor. He knew all about her, Taylor did. The only one who ever did. He knew what she was made of. He'd had the last ounce out of her. He and the doctor at her 5 confinements, those men knew. Nobody else, ever. Me was his son. Me was welcome. He could stay. Henceforth he ate with the family and lodged in the extra loose box. And Araminty Brown, embedded in fat, her keen, hooded eyes hardly lifting the rolls above them, cooked admirably, ran the accounts, watched the shop, looked after the till, spoke seldom. National Velvet too. Interfered hardly ever, sighed sometimes, because it would have taken a war on her home soil, the birth of a colony, or a great cataclysm to have dug from her what she was born for, moved about the house, brought up her 4 taught daughters under her heavy eye, and thought of death occasionally with a kind of sardonic shrug. Nobody could have said exactly whether she had a dull brain or no. Ed and Mally and Meredith behaved themselves at the wink of one of her heavy eyes. Velvet would have laid down her stringy life for her. Your ma said me, swerve the bellaful. Pity she weighs what she does. Why, said Mally. Binds her up, said me. And it was not constipation he was thinking of. Me, said Mally to her mother, thinks you ought to be riding in Lewis races. Mrs. Brown made a noise in her nose. What, said Mally. That's all right, said Mrs. Brown. You can never tell what mother's thinking, said Mally to Velvet. She doesn't think where we do, said Velvet. She thinks at the back. In the sitting room at the close of supper, Mrs. Brown stretched out an arm and turned the Albert lamp lower. Box, said Mr. Brown, indicating the sideboard. Winner rose and brought him his small cigar. The shadows whirled. Monday, said Mrs. Brown. Driving night, said Velvet. What I was thinking, said Mrs. Brown. Get on off. Is National Velvet. First, said Velvet asterisk. First, said Mrs. Brown asterisk. Velvet hunched her shoulder blades and sniffed. Was driving worth it? She never could make up her mind. Out of bed it didn't seem so, but in bed it was worthwhile. Hush, she said suddenly and held up her hand. Cough. She said, and went to the slaughterhouse door. Gone to MB Miss Ada's chest, said me, grinning. In the sitting room the books for homework came out again. Gotta see a boy, murmured me as he went out into the street. Velvet lit the hurricane lamp standing in the corner of the empty slaughterhouse and passed through to the shed where the old pony lived. Miss Ada was an old pink roan gone grey with age, her ears permanently back, a look of irritation about her creased nostrils, backbone sagging, horny growths on her legs. Hello, said Velvet and opened the door. Miss Ada moved definitely round and turned her backside on Velvet. Velvet put her hand on the quarters and the skin twitched irritably. You never do anything about being decent, said Velvet asterisk. Have you got a cough? Miss Ada bent her head suddenly and rubbed the itch off her right nostril onto her leg, and as she did it she flashed a robust, contemptuous look at Velvet. Is there sugar, said the look, or no sugar? I want no subtleties, no sentimentalities. I don't care about your state of National Velvet 13. Heart, your wretched conscience prickings, your ambitious desires. Is there sugar or no sugar? State your reasons for coming to see me and leave me to brood. Velvet produced a piece of sugar and the pony bent her head round with a look of insolence, as though she still suspected the sugar to be an imitation lump. She took it with her lips, but she pressed her old teeth for a minute on the child's palm, and at this trick, as old as Velvet's childhood, Velvet thrust her arms over the sagging backbone and buried her face among the knobbles of the spine. The pony munched her lump stolidly, flirting her head up and down as though she were fishing for extra grains high up among her teeth. If we had another pony, said Velvet, nobody would love you less. But we can't go on like this, it's awful. The gymkhanas all coming and nothing to ride. And you hate all that. It puts you in your worst mood. The door opened and Mally came in. Has she got a cough? She hasn't coughed since I've been here, said Velvet. Get over, you awful old thing, said Mally, and let me pass. Don't, Mally. The only way is to be as horrid to her as she is to us. I've left the lamp down there. Hang it up somewhere. I can't reach the hook. Mally hung the lamp carefully out of way of the straw. The two sat up on the manger together. The pony, utterly disgusted, drew her ears back almost flat with her head, hung out her twitching underlip and faced round at an angle from them, her tail tucked sourly in. Look at her, I said Mally. My God, what a mount, 114 National Velvet. Velvet took out her plate and wrapped it in her handkerchief. Don't you leave it here, said Mally. It won't help us any. It was your plate fiddling that went wrong at supper. Mally got up onto the manger's rim, reached to a ledge of wood below the window and took down 2 sticks of dark gold paper. Crunchy, said Velvet, her face lighting. I got them this morning. On tick still. Yes. She was cross, but I swore we'd pay by Saturday. In the gold paper was a chocolate stick. Beneath the chocolate was a sort of honeycomb, crisp and friable, something between biscuit and burnt sugar. Fry's chocolate crunchy. Not one of the sisters ate any other kind of sweet that year. It was their year's choice. The year before it had been caramel crispies. We must pay her. She's a wispy woman. She's pappy. Aren't you queer about people? Always cutting them down to the bone. I don't like people, said Velvet, except us and Mother and me. I like only horses. Pity you weren't a boy. I should have been a poor thin boy. With muscles just on one arm. From meat chopping. As it is, said Mally, we're all going into tills. Into cages. To count out money. I'm not, said Velvet, examining her crunchy. Do you like the end best or the middle? I like the ones that don't seem cooked. Sticky in the middle. National Velvet 15. I wish I had a proper coat with checks, said Velvet. You. Why, Edwina's never had one. Edwina isn't me. I'm not going to be a jersey jumping child in a gymkhana anymore. I don't know how we're going to do anything in the gymkhanas at all. Miss Ada's turning sourer and sourer on us. She'll end by refusing to go into the ring. Miss Ada, seduced by the smell of the chocolate, turned slowly towards them, approaching by fractions. It's all right, Mally, I'll give her a bit of mine, said Velvet. You bought M. It doesn't matter who bought M, said Mally. We're all owing together. She can have a crumb of mine too. Don't blow so, you idiot, she sneezed her crumb off my hand. Miss Ada stooped her head and began a vain search for 1 chocolate crumb and 2 inches of dingy straw. The stable door opened and me put his head in. Meredith in here? No. What you want her for? Canary Breeders Annuals card. Come on, last post. Don't know where she is, said Malvalia. She won't be fit to live with for weeks. Me, called a voice from the dark. In here. He's got your canary breeder. Mother said so, 1-0. I'll come in. Give it to me. Meredith took the book from me. You've taken off the wrapper, she said disappointedly. I like to take it off myself, and leant back against Miss Ada, unconscious of the pony's body. Another time you can fetch your own annual, said me. L6 National Velvet. Bet you don't remember next year, said Mally. Listen to this. Listen to this. It's what I always thought, I said Meredith. Listen to Mr. Lukey. He says, J. Lukey Esquire, it's signed. He says cod liver oil should be given to mating birds. My own birds did magnificently on Poon's finch, Mr. Cod liver. Dot. Miss Ada removed her support sharply and Meredith sat violently on the straw. Blast, she said, without looking round at the pony, opened the annual and searched again for the page. Yes, but his birds were already mating, said Mally. You keep wanting to give them the cod liver oil to make them mate. It doesn't make them mate. Lukey doesn't say it does. I don't see why, said Meredith, still hunting for the page. You've got to be lively to mate. Vital or something. Cod liver oil gives vitality. I read it. It's here. Gives vitality to the mating bird. Miss Ada'll step on your hand if you leave it there, said Velvet. Meredith got slowly up, reading as she rose. It doesn't say whether it's the cockbird or the hen. Which do you think it is, me? Cock before, hen after, said me. There you are, said Meredith. I wish Mother D let me order it. You got it all over the sofa last time. But I've got a fountain pen filler now. I've trained the cock on drops of water. He's as good as gold. The hen makes a fuss. I could do her in the yard. Beth, said Edwina from the darkness outside. They filed out without a word, Meredith reading to the last by the flare of the hurricane lamp. The spring gale. National Velvet. L7. CC. Had gone. The spring sky was indefinite and still, with a star in it. There was a new moon. Are you coming, Velvet? 5. You can't leave MSS Ada with nothing when we've used her stable. I'll be a second. She opened the corn bin and Miss Ada dropped 10 years off her looks. She plunged her nose on the 2 hands that cupped the corn and ducked her head to sniff out the droppings before they sank too far in the straw. Velvet, alone, saw the new moon. She bowed 3 times, glanced round to see that no one saw, then standing in the shadow of the stable door she put her hands like thin white arrows together and prayed to the moon, "Oh God, give me horses, I let me be the best rider in England." 1. B. Chapter 2. The next morning Meredith had to take some suet and a shin of beef over to Pendian. School was at 9. It was the last day of term. She rose at 6. Me called her on his way downstairs. He heated the coffee left over from last night and gave her 3 sardines between 2 pieces of bread. Then Meredith went out to saddle Miss Ada. Miss Ada had a crupper to her saddle, partly because the hills were so steep and partly because she had no shoulders. Meredith forgot the crupper and left it dangling. She put the girths on twisted, put the canary breeder in the basket with the suet, and started off. Miss Ada tapped smartly up the village street on the tarmac. The flints on the church shone like looking glass. Meredith trotted east into the rising sun. Her toes were warm and the sardines and the bread and coffee digested comfortingly. Over the hullocks and down into the valleys, sun and shadow, cup and saucer, through the tarred gate, the wired gate, the broken gate, and finally into the Pendian Valley and to the house. She gave in the beef and the suet, would have stopped to talk to Lucy the farm daughter, only Lucy had a temperature, started on the home journey, crupper still dangling, and Miss Ada restive now from the sore of the twisted girth. "We'll go the dead horse patch way," said Meredith suddenly, aloud, and then disliked the sound of the spoken words in the lonely landscape. One of Miss Ada's eats came forward. They were above the village now, though still 2 miles away. There were 2 ways down. 18. National Velvet 19. To the sea level. One by the 2 steep fields and the chalk road whence she had come up, the other by 2 more steep fields, 2 gates, a broken reaping machine, a cabbage field, to a haystack, and a place where a horse had once dropped dead. For 13 years Miss Ada had said that place was haunted. She had told Mr. Brown so plainly when Velvet was crawling. And he had never insisted with her, but let her come down the way she had planned for herself by the chalk road. Now to Meredith's mind came the desire to take Miss Ada the way she had never been taken by Edwina, Malvolia, Velvet or herself. Even before the division of the ways the intention became communicated to the pony. A hardening took place, a clenching of spirit. A weight came into Miss Ada's head. She hung it provocatively upon her bit. Meredith sat uneasily and watchfully in her saddle. Miss Ada's way was to the left. Meredith's was to the right. Miss Ada had 2 methods of getting her way. Either she didn't seat at all, or when Meredith pulled she seated too fast and whipped round. This method she chose and the saddle slipped over on the 2 slack girths. Meredith fell off. Miss Ada with a look of sudden youth flicked her heels, cantered to the wire fence, stooped her head and cropped. The basket with the canarge breeder had fallen to and Meredith, getting up, picked up her annual carrot, glanced at Miss Ada and after a minute sat down in the sun to read. She was now faced with a walk home. Nobody ever caught Miss Ada once she was loose. She would go home her own way and at her own time. Meredith read comfortably what Mr. Lukey had to say, then closed her book and trudged off. 20 National Velvet. "You'll look an idiot," she said partingly to Miss Ada, "coming home with your saddle all upside down." The whites of Miss Ada's eyes glinted as she cropped. Meredith went down towards the dead horse patch. When she was out of sight, Miss Ada moved off by the way she had intended to go. Meredith ran down over a steep field that lay in shadow with its back to the rising sun, then up the opposite slope with the sun shining on her back. Over the rise she saw a rider in the distance nearing the haystack that stood at the edge of the cabbage field, the haystack where the legendary horse had laid down and died. The rider coming towards her, she could not see at first whether he was walking or trotting. Then came a flick of movement and he was off. The horse as usual had shied at the dead horse patch. When Meredith reached him he was on his feet dusting himself down, a tripper rider, a great lad with loose flannel trousers and bicycle clips. The horse, like Miss Ada, was cropping feverishly as though it had never seen grass before. "You got Mr. Belton's bumblebee," said Meredith. "What's the matter with him?" "Seen a ghost," said the young man. "Yes, he did," said Meredith. "Eh? How?" "You had a fall too," eyeing the green grass stain on her hip. Meredith looked round to see if Miss Ada was in sight. "Been sliding," she said. "Can we catch the horse?" said the tripper. "Maybe," said Meredith, "but I shouldn't think so. I got to be in time for school." "Jumped his whole length sideways," said the tripper. National Velvet 21. "They always do, here," said Meredith, edging gently towards the horse. "Why here?" "There's a ghost in the ground." "A horse ghost?" "Steams up mornings and evenings. Especially early when there's a dew drying off." Her hand was within a foot of the reins, extended soothingly. The young man saw her intention and ran round the other side. The horse, startled, removed itself another length away. "You mucked it," said Meredith. "I must get on." Miss Ada got home first. Velvet was putting saltpetre on her girth ball as she stood in the sunlight on the street by the front door. The saddle was pitched up on the railings. The front door was open and Mr. Brown, bareheaded, was enjoying his after-breakfast pipe. "My girl," he said when he saw Meredith, "you're 15, and you?" Meredith nodded and stood still before him. 7 years you've saddled that pony and put her bits of leather on her, and to this day you only hang them round her like blind cords. She's got a sore take a week to heal." Miss Ada looked at Meredith with smug reproach. "If it was canaries," muttered Velvet, dabbing with a rag. Meredith glowered at Velvet as she passed her to go in for her school books. Inside the sitting room Nee was telling Donald to get on with his porridge. It was cold porridge, turned out of a cup. There was a hole in the top and treacle was poured inside. Donald was laying a sap from the side into the center. "You aren't eating what you cut out," said me. 22 National Velvet. Cleaning a rat trap with emery paper and the rust covering the cloth in showers. "I am," said Donald. But he wasn't. "Donald done yet?" called Mrs. Brown. "I'm washing the plates." "He's fiddling," said me. Mrs. Brown came to the door. "You get down and bring that porridge in here," she said as she rubbed a plate. The sweetness of Donald's face remained unchanged. He watched the treacle run out down the sap. "I don't," he drawled. Mrs. Brown gave no second chances. It was her strength. She took Donald in one great arm and the plate of porridge in the other and removed him. The sweetness of his face was still unchanged. "He'll never eat that," said Meredith. "You're sitting on my atlas." Me pulled it out from beneath him. "He never eats anything he's fiddled with," said me, "because it's turned into something else in his mind. Hark to them hammering. You'd never think, to look at the green, that there'd be a fair in 24 hours. Just a lot of old sticks and men hitting them in. It'll be ready. You won't be though." "I'm just going. Last day. Holidays tomorrow. All 4 hanging round the house all day. Life'll be a joke." "This bit of millet," me said Meredith, dragging a length out of the sideboard drawer. "Stick it in for the mail." "Me, please." National Velvet 23. "Them birds." Meredith blocked the light in the doorway and was gone. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Blast and hell," said me softly. He had caught his finger in the rat trap. "Hell," said Donald softly in the doorway. His silver hair hung in a lock over his forehead. His eyes were film maze and blue, with film lashes. His platinum blonde, Hollywood head was set on a green jersey. His bottom was bare and his pants hung down unbuttoned. "You've got off your pot once," said me threateningly. "Get on back." Donald disappeared again into the inner room, his behinds gleaming like the white polish of 2 peeled and hard-boiled eggs. Edwina went into Worthing for a piano lesson. Mally, Meredith and Velvet waded through a last day of grammar and map reading behind the walls of the village school. The children's voices droned behind the windows and the hammering on the village green increased. At break the children watched the hammers from the corner of the asphalt yard. The greasy pole was up, the coke smut shies were up, there was a frail porch with welcome written on it. Marks for the term were read out, and prizes given. Malvalia got Hiawatha. At home it was steak and kidney pudding for dinner, and Mr. Brown poured in the boiling water through a hole in the suet. Velvet kept her plate in and swallowed whole. The kidneys went down like stones. Mr. Brown finished his meat fancier as he ate. Donald ate his meat well and said gently some 6 or 7 times, "Is it castle puddings?" Nobody knew. His question was not. 24 National Velvet. Insistent but soft. Sometimes he said it through his meat. "You're spitting," Donald said me. "I said Donald, dreamily. Mrs. Brown looked at him. "It is," she said. "You never used to tell us," said Velvet. "Time," said Mrs. Brown, "I don't do what I always did." Malvalia dared the plates. Mrs. Brown fetched in a city of castle puddings and a jam pot full of heated jam. She served Donald, the baby, first. 2 castle puddings and a dab of jam on the plate. He looked at his 2 puddings and began to examine them. He drooped his Hollywood head like a smiling angel. "Fiddling again," said me ominously. "You wanted them too much. You're putting it into his head," said Mally. Edwina walked in and put down her music roll and her hat. She pulled a chair up. "Your bits there," said Mrs. Brown, "on the sideboard." "Governor and me we wash," said me into his plate. "Funny how men wash for girls and girls don't wash for men." "Anybody knows boys are dirtier than girls," said Mally. "Maybe. But grown men wash freer than women." Edwina sat down, ignoring criticism. Get on," said Mrs. Brown to Donald. "I am getting on," said Donald, and opened his mouth to show that it was full. "Been turning round and round," said me. "Give a swallow." "National Velvet 2J. "Can't swatter," said Donald, "tisn't he slidey?" "Isn't he lovely," said Velvet, coming out of a dream quite suddenly and looking as though she had seen him for the first time. "Shall I teach you to ride, Donald?" "You've put him off proper," said Mrs. Brown. Donald opened his eyes and struggled with his mouth. Then he leant over his plate and spat out the revolving mass. "Yes," he said, "when he was empty, yes, when. Now." Mrs. Brown rose slowly, took her own empty plate away to the sideboard, moved calmly and without anger round to Donald. "You'll finish alone," she said, and gathered him up. Donald and his plate sailed into the back kitchen. "Well, really, Velvet," said Edwina. "He doesn't care," said Velvet. "Wouldn't he be lovely in the under 6? "On Miss Ada," said Matty. "She's too wide, really. You want Alec D. narrow thing like Lucy S. Rowanbury." "Lucy never can find anyone small enough to ride Rowanbury anyway." "Could we start him, Father?" said Velvet. "Eh," said Mr. Brown, struggling to leave his page. "Teach Donald. So's he could be ready for the under 6. "Under what?" said Mr. Brown. "The under what?" "Gee, Weimgarner," said Velvet. "The class for children under 6. 6 years. "Ask your mother," said Mr. Brown, and returned to his page. "Then that's that," said Velvet, rising happily. "Can I get down?" Z6 National Velvet. There was no answer. "F what I have received, thank God," said Velvet to no one in particular, and disappeared into the kitchen. "Did you give them that millet?" said Meredith suddenly. "Forgot," said me. "F what I have received, thank God," said Meredith with a dark look at him, and shot from the room. Mr. Brown pushed back his chair. "You girls said your grace," he said, getting up. "F what I have received, thank God," said Edwina. And the meal was finished. Asterisk 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 asterisk. The candle in the scarlet painted candlestick was burned low and had a shroud. The bottle candle was high and gave a good light. Spring and evening sky showed between undrawn cotton curtains. Mrs. Brown sat on a stout mahogany chair before her dressing table, and Velvet knelt behind her, unhooking her dress from neck to waist at the back. The dress was dark blue rep, built firm. It was like unhooking the string on a shrunk sofa covering. Hook after hook, Velvet traveled down till at last she reached far below the waist. Then Mrs. Brown stood up and the dark blue dress dropped to the floor, leaving her in a princess petticoat like a great cotton lily. The strings of this, untied at neck and waist by Velvet, disclosed her in bus bodice, stays and dark blue cloth knickers. "The iodine's in the wall cupboard," said Mother. Velvet went to the wall cupboard and extracted the iodine from an army of bottles and jars. National Velvet. Z7. CC. L5 the cotton wool /5, said Mother. Velvet, behind her, undid the strings of the bust bodice. Got down to bedrock, she knelt and examined the wound. Muse 5, take your stays off, Mother 55. Mrs. Brown rose and drew breath. Working from the bottom up, she unhooked the metal fencework within which she lived, and sat down again. Star out, 55, she said, staring through the window. The star was like a slip of silver tinfoil plumb between the hang of the curtains. Said Velvet, and she glanced at the star over her mother's shoulder. Metals worked right through the top of the stays and cut you, said Velvet. Ought to get whalebone, said Mrs. Brown, sniffing at her own economy. Yes, said Velvet, you ought. S made a nasty place. She dapped the iodine on the abrasion caused by the jutting shaft of the stays. Hurt. Stings, said Mrs. Brown. The star winked and stuttered. Stick on a band-aid piece, said Mrs. Brown. There's a tin in the cupboard. Velvet stuck the plaster onto the white hard back. Mrs. Brown glared at the star. Pray to God, why don't he get fat, child, she said. Velvet sat back on her heels aghast. You can't be, said Mrs. Brown, what you don't took. You can, said Velvet. You are, Mother. Maybe, said Mrs. Brown. But you gotta dig. You gotta know. You gotta believe. Velvet put her thin arms on her mother's shoulders. 28 National Velvet. And kissed her on the enemy fat. She winced at a sign of regret or weakness in the beloved mountain. There's nothing you can't do, Mother. You've got us all beat. Me thinks you're God Almighty. And we all do. Mrs. Brown smiled in the glass. Chut, child. Don't mount up in a torment. I'm not grumbling. I'm out of condition, but it came on me. I'm only saying. You poor thin hairpin. Keep thin. There's no song and dance. Mrs. Brown was bolting herself back into the fence. She stood upright. It's awful to grow up, said Velvet. Nope, said Mrs. Brown. Why isn't it? Things come suitable to the time, said Mrs. Brown. The thin slip, the quivering twig, looked back at her mother. Lot o' nonsense, said Mrs. Brown, talked about growing up. She stepped into her princess petticoat and drew it up. Tie me, she said. The candle in the red candlestick drowned itself in fat and went out. Childbirth, said the voice, gruff and soothing, talking to the star and to the child, and the child knelt at the strings of the petticoat, and being in love. And death. You can't know till you come to M. No use guessing and dreading. You can call it pain. But what's pain? Depends on who you are and how you take it. Tie that bottom string looser. Don't you dread nothing. Velvet. But you're so mighty. Like a tree, said Velvet. Shivery to be your age. You don't know nothing. Later on you get coated over. Silence, and the hypnotic night. It's a good thing to be coated over. You don't change nothing underneath. National Velvet 29. All the same it's awful to grow up, said Velvet. All this changing, and got to be ready for something. I don't ever want children. Only horses. Who can tell, said Mrs. Brown. I've got me, said Velvet, putting her thin hand across her breast. I can't ever be anything else but me. You're all safe, said Mrs. Brown carelessly, stooping with grunts to pull up her dress. You got both of us, you art me. Say your prayers now and get along. Not yet, not yet. Say your prayers, I say. Down on your knees and say your prayers. You go plunging off this time o' night, don't you? Getting into your bed all of a days and a worry. Say your prayers, I say one. Velvet went on her knees in the middle of the floor. Mrs. Brown sat down, the dress in wreaths around her, and took a knife to her nails. V father. CH. R10 even mumbled the voice from the floor. The blue in the window had gone and the star had companions. Power NA glory me N. Mother. Yes. You're all right, aren't you? Am as good as living forever. Get on off to bed. NFM not calling to say goodnight. Father is. Velvet kissed her. Come and say goodnight. No, I'm not. Hook me up before you go. Velvet nicked up the great line of steely hooks to the top. Now go. Velvet went. Child gets all alight at night, said Mrs. Brown to herself. Velvet's head came back round the door. Good night, mother, where you going? 30 National Velvet. Down the village. What for? Will you go? Mrs. Brown went down the village with the key of the empty shop in her pocket. She had accounts to finish. The hulks rose above her in hoops into the sky. The stars floated in the olive blaze of the weedy pond. The boys and girls were hushed, black and still, against the doorways. Edwina stood like a statue at the cobbler's doorway as her mother passed, but her mother knew her. Growing, muttered Mrs. Brown as she went on. Poor lass has to hide it. The beautiful boy beside Edwina breathed again. He was golden-haired, and trying for the police. He felt he had no real chance for Mr. Brown's Edwina, and he had no idea he was her breathtaking first man. What all Velvet? Murmured Mrs. Brown, looking a moment at the sky, and seeing Velvet's bony, fairy face. What all men say about my Velvet? The sound of hoofs striking on metalled road came out of the darkness, and down the street, all alone, galloped a horse. Bodies shot out of the doorways and shouts sprang from shadows. Something black and white and furious raced down the street. Mrs. Brown stopped and stepped off the pavement. With a striking of hoofs, sparks flying on the flints, a piebald horse, naked of leather, wild and alone, slid almost to his haunches and stood stock still, shaking and panting. He lowered his head. A suitor for Velvet. A suitor for Velvet. The horse glared at Mrs. Brown. It had strange eyes, a white walleye and one of darkest blue. The light from the corner street lamp swam in its National Velvet 31 eyeballs. It trembled and glared, then at Mrs. Brown's slowly extended hand, shook its neck with a shudder, half-reared, and turning, galloped off up the street towards the Hullocks. That perishing piebald from Eads, exclaimed a voice. That you, Mr. Crew? Give me a turn, said Mr. Crew. That's the third time this week that creature's got loose. Eads says he'll raffle him for the fate. Wouldn't be a bad idea. Wonderful what you get for those raffles. While Malvalia and Meredith were undressing, Velvet was driving her big toes with long pieces of tape. She lay on her back in bed, her knees bent, talking in a monotonous voice like a sleepwalker. Careful through the gate now. Mind now. Get on. Satin, and she gave the side of her thigh a switch with a light twig she held in her hand. The long tapes ran through her fingers which she held on her stomach, and both her knees pranced up and down, a rested pair of well-matched chestnuts in the shooting wagonette. With another switch and a spring forward, the knees rose slightly in the air, were drawn back firmly by the reins, reined in, and stood still before the porch of the old castle. The door opened and Mr. Brown surveyed the spectacle of his youngest daughter, bare to the waist, her nightgown fallen on her chest, the bedclothes peeled to the floor, her eyes bright and her toes chained to her hands by tapes. Mally was cleaning her teeth in her drawers. Meredith was covering the bird cages. Mother says it's time, he said, removing his pipe. Ah. You're daft. Velvet. 32 National Velvet. FM only allowed on Mondays. I've 2 minutes more. Where do you get it from, I want to know? Do you other girls go driving nights a week? I used to, said Mally. Now FM bigger. Mother says FLL break the bed. Where's the base of the cages gone to? Velvet's used it under Miss Ada's saddle. That time she got a sore back. What's that you got on them? It's Edwina's knickers she had for the party. They got burnt, drying. Shame them in your good knickers. Canaries wake early with that thin stuff. Thought I heard them yesterday morning. Where's Edwina? Be up in a minute. Just gone down the street a second. There. I finished, said Velvet, fishing for the bedclothes from her bed. The chestnuts hardly needed a rub down. They were cool. I've left the roan cob for tonight. He can stay out to grass. Daft as a sparrow, said Mr. Brown at random. I doubt if a girl ought to be what you are. Stooping, with his pipe in his mouth, he flung the bedclothes up on top of her, blew out the candle and made for the door. FM not in bed one, said Mally. Then you ought to be, said Mr. Brown. Say your prayers. And disappeared. Velvet heard the cruelty and wild abandon of the iron feet and shuddered and sat up, excited. It was too late to move. The horse was gone. Gone into the sea. Was it a horse? The bed clung round her like protecting arms. National Velvet. 33. Did you hear it? From the bed beside her. In 3 beds 3 bodies were upright. Edwina's bed was empty. Then, after the pause, the iron feet plunged back again, and too late all 3 were at the window. The door opened and the curtains blew. Edwina. Yes. Hush. Edwina was panting. She had flown up the street and up the stairs. Father put the light out. Yes. What horse? Did he say about me not being here? I dare say he thought you'd gone with Mother. What horse? Piebald. Ead's piebald. Let me. Didn't know Ead had a piebald. How do you know what? Be quiet. Get back. I'm getting into bed. Aren't you going to wash? No. Teeth, said Mally, impressed. No. You been with Teddy, said Mally with satisfaction, getting back to bed. You shut up, said Edwina. Won't tell you about the horse. There's nothing to tell, piebald horse. Farmer Eads. Teddy's told you that. Ha, and near ran into Mother, I snarled Edwina, naked, pulling her dressing gown over the clothes tumbled on the chair. Mother. What's it done to Mother, said Velvet sharply. Mother was in the street, said Edwina in a wasp's. 34 National Velvet. Voice, pulling on her pajamas. Touched her. Knocked her, said Velvet, flashing out of bed. Keep your hair on, said Edwina. Bitch, sobbed Velvet and flew out of the door and down the stairs. Now you bitched yourself, said Mally calmly. Now they'll know you been out with Teddy. You know well Mother's not hurt. Of course she isn't hurt. Should I be here, I hissed Edwina. Stringing Velvet off like a catapult. First you go off with boys. Second you upset Velvet. Third you'll be found out. Fourth Velvet'll be sick all night. Sense, haven't you? Be quiet, said Edwina, in bed, in a dull strangled voice. Meredith. Mary. Get her back. What did the horse do to Mother, Edwina? Sort of bowed to her. Slid to a full stop and hung its head and really sort of bowed to her. And it reared and dashed back up the street home again. Get Velvet, Mary. Father was sitting looking at nothing in the living room. He was just tipping his chair and swaying. Father, said Velvet, scared, in the doorway, is Mother all right? Fine, said Father without moving. He turned his eyes slowly. In the shadow behind the sideboard sat me mending Jacob's collar. There's been a horse down the street. Dot. Said Velvet uncertainly. National Velvet 35. Gallopin, assented Father round the stem of his pipe. There was a pause. I dreamt it hit Mother, mumbled Velvet. You did? Yes. But it was a horse. That wasn't the dream. I just come up the street, said me. Your ma's sitting with the blinds up, in the shop, totting up. I'll go back, said Velvet. It was a dream. She turned and saw Meredith's face come round the doorway from the dark stairs. I had a dream, Meredith, she said. I'm coming back. Me put the collar down and crossing to Velvet bent down and felt her ankles. Hold as railings, he said. I'll get you a brick. Keep your stomach steady. He disappeared into the kitchen and Velvet turned back to the stairs. Suddenly, at the stairhead something caught her jumping heart. She was back in the room again at her father's side, by his tipping, swaying chair. You all right, too, father, she whispered. He put his arm round her and pulled her on his lap. You get them teeth straight, he said to her, and rocked her meditatively while his pipe smoked up through her cotton hair. B. Chapter 3. The back window on the yard was blocked with cactus pots. In front of the window stood the fern table with 2 big ferns in brass holders. The street window had pots of blue and red and pied cineraria standing along its shelf, looking like a Union Jack. The eastern light of the morning burst through the cactus greenery on Mally laying the table with a darned and yellowing cloth. She clattered the crockery on from the sideboard, and the girls' voices called from the larder and kitchen. Mice bin at the bottom. It's all run out one. Mice where? Porridge packet. They've made a hole. Don't cut the rim off the toast, D-winner. I like him with the binding. Me looked in with a packet in his hand. Hers Velvet. Velvet. Coming down now. Me's got your pumice. Me, said Velvet coming through the attic stair door. Oh, thank you. Me. Do it now, said Me. Clean my plate before breakfast, said Velvet, outraged. Your PA's sure to ask. I do it after breakfast, what's the good of doing it before? 6. National Velvet. 37. C. Acids of the night, said Me and disappeared. Acids of what? Get on and do it, said Mally. You'd think that plate was jewelry, I said Velvet and went into the scullery. Cost more than your mother's engagement ring, said Mr. Brown, passing through to the slaughterhouse. She grumbling again. Gone to clean it, said Mally. Kedgeree. Mother brought in the soup basin of kedgeree. Donald stumped near her skirts. Edwina and Velvet came in and sitting down began to eat. I've been sick in the night, said Donald. You haven't, said Mrs. Brown. Get on your chair. Why haven't I? Demanded Donald. Don't let him start whining, said Mally. Why haven't I say? Demanded Donald. Tell me why, I say. Get onto your chair and don't let's hear any more about it, said Mrs. Brown. Why haven't I say? Donald held on. You changed my sheets. The new ones was cold. I changed your sheets for other reasons, said Mrs. Brown. Now get on. The new ones was horrible, muttered Donald, subsiding. Is it kedgeree? Did you wash your neck? Velvet. Yes, mother. Before your frock or after your frock? After. Then don't. Your frock's soaking. Where's Meredith? 38 National Velvet. Canaries loose. Mr. Brown opened the door again and came in. Donald brightened. I was sick in the night, Daddy. Donald won. I was sick all over. Mrs. Brown removed Donald and the kedgeree to the kitchen. Lie. He wet his bed, said Mally. Oh, said Mr. Brown and helped himself to kedgeree. I heard your mother moving about. Why don't she leave him wet? He won't hurt. He's no more than damp. Bad for his habits, said Mrs. Brown, returning. She sat down and drew the marmalade towards her. I've caught her one. Meredith came in glowing. Take your kedgeree into the kitchen and let Donald tell you how sick he's been, said Velvet. You'll do no such thing, said Mrs. Brown. That child gets on one idea like a railway track. It's you and your stomach. Velvet, that puts him onto it. Can't help my stomach, said Velvet. Do give anything in the world to change it. You'll grow out of it. 16, you said. 16, I said. Why 16? You eat, said Mrs. Brown. Can I come back now? Donald appeared in the doorway, holding his plate unsteadily in his fists. Yes, if you've finished. I've finished. All. All except the bones. Jacob's eaten them. Oh. Velvet flew up and left the room. Me. National Velvet. C. Why? 39. She called into the yard from the kitchen. Jacob's eaten fish bones. Donald lifted his plate to the sideboard and the spoon flew over his head to the floor. That child say he finished, demanded Mr. Brown. I finished said Donald. It's all on his plate still said Mr. Brown, and went on reading his paper. Velvet, called Mally. It's a do. Velvet, I come back. Jacob hasn't got a bone. Velvet appeared in the doorway. Donald, said Mrs. Brown, turning full on him, have you told me a story? It was a story, said Donald gravely. Do you know what a story is? No, said Donald. Mrs. Brown removed him to her bedroom. Piebald's gone down the street again, said me, putting his hair in at the door and disappearing. The four sisters rose and streamed from the room. Mr. Brown, glancing up once and half turning round, went on with his paper. Mrs. Brown returned. Donald, sorry, said me. Brown. He's thinking, said Mrs. Brown. He isn't sure. Girl's gone. That piebald of Ede's got loose again, said Mr. Brown. There was peace and silence. The tiny window pane between the cineraria was filled with black and white, and the piebald went back up the street at a hand gallop. After his metal feet the street rustled with running shoes. That animal'll knock down a pram one of these days, observed Mr. Brown. Seems to make for the sea. 40 National Velvet. Curious horse, said Mrs. Brown. Climbs out in the night when the moon's up. Don't he jump, said Mr. Brown. Jumps a house, said Mrs. Brown. Sort of rodeo, so they say. Yes, Donald. What is it? I'm sorry, called Donald in muffled tones through the door. Mrs. Brown opened the door. I'm sorry, I was sick in the night, said Donald. Child'll make a lawyer, said Mr. Brown. Meredith returned to the room. He went right through the polls there, hammering up for the fair, she said. Then down to the post office, and slid about and up the chalk road back onto the hullocks again. Mr. Ede was just going by in his cart. Cursed. He'll get into trouble if that horse hurts someone, said father. Me done his breakfast. Had it early. He's got given a glass tongue. Ate it in his room. Well, tell em I want em at 12 for 6 sheep. Mr. Brown passed away through the slaughterhouse door. Me came in from the street. 6 sheep at 12, father says. Piebald jumped a 5-bar gate with a wire on the top. Sailed over. Who says so? Fellow. Is it broke? The gate. No. The piebald. Ede says it's as quiet as a lamb. Just can't bear to be shut up. Bit mad. National Velvet 41. Me blew his nose carefully, polished it, replaced his handkerchief and went for the yard door. You got a bit of time, said Meredith. Get on and do your canaries. Gotta sweep my room. Done my canaries. FLL come and 5 sweep yours. Me sniffed and went off. Meredith caught up a broom which stood beside the wall. You put that down, said me, who knew she had taken it without turning his head. Your ma's own. The broom was meekly put back. Meredith followed him. Me's room was outside, next to Miss Ada. It was an old loose box that had fallen into disrepair. He took great pride in it and kept it spotless. Just within the door, which was propped open for freshness with a garden rake, was a large hole in the floor filled with rotting wood. The wood round the edges of the hole gave way like toast, and me had marked a white ring round the hole and written in paint, step further than this. He took his own broom and began to sweep. Got no hairs on it, said Meredith, standing about and in the way. No answer. Me did not like criticism. He swept the dust of the room vigorously into a heap, then propelled it with his brush over a portion of the painted line and into the hole in the floor. Picking up an old milk bottle by the neck, he rammed the dust horizontally under the floorboards. Now what you want, he said. Hammer and nails, said Meredith. Go out of the room then. Thursday no call for you to see where I keep things. National Velvet. 9:42. E. Meredith went outside into the sunny yard and stood with her back to the wall on the far side of the door. Honorably she looked away and straight before her. Me went to his bed and abstracted a hammer and tobacco box of nails from under his mattress. How big? He called. Meredith measured her thumb joint. 1.5 inches. Wherefore? Hang my roller cage. Find a joist then. It's rubble and such in between. Me came to the doorway with the hammer and nails. Do you think? Began Meredith. No, said me shortly. You get into your own hot water for putting your own nails in the house. Your PA's down the village. I know, said Meredith. Why I'm hurrying. She disappeared with the hammer and nails, and me took down his shaving mirror and polished it with his handkerchief. He replaced a drawing pin or two on the corners of his series of Grand National winners pinned round the walls, and set the kettle onto his primus that he might scald out his milk bottle. Velvet and Mally appeared in the yard and hung about. Where's Mary? Hammering, said me. Silence fell and the kettle hummed. Mally and Velvet looked with envy from the yard into the loose boke's bedroom. Wish I had a room of my own, said Velvet. So I could hang up pictures. Me came to the door, and holding the milk bottle. National Velvet 43. Over the hole in the floor poured the scalding water into it. I've earned it, said me when the last drop was in. Why? Full grown, he said, and sucked the gap in his teeth. He looked at them, long and straight. They looked back. They're putting that piebald up to raffle, he said at last, and yawned deceptively. Raffle, said Velvet, raffle. A pause. Then, anybody might get it. Anybody with a shilling. Cost 1 a shilling. You got a shilling, Mally? Nothing at all. Nor I've got nothing. Oh, a shilling's easy got. But we ought to have 5. Donald ought to have a chance. You'll never get 5-1. That's her, you're wrong, said me. I'll give you 5. You can pay me back in your time. I got a tip from a perisher. Oh, me darling. What perisher? Topped up perisher that was swanky and windy and couldn't sit his horse in his best suit. What'd you do? Fellow hired Belton's Mayday and went out galloping. Top boots, spurs and checks, and a bowler with a string on it. Where were you? Just walking. Oh me. You were sitting behind the haystack with the ghost. 44. National Velvet. Had to sit somewhere. Tell us. I saw Mayday go out. Galloped out. Perishady never heard of walking or trotting. Half the sky was dancing up and down under his bottom, so I legged up the other way and come to the haystack. Pause. And he galloped round it, Velvet. I see him coming down towards the haystack. Mayday blowy and sweaty and the ghost waiting for them as jolly as a daisy. Oh. Me. You. Saw it. It. No, it's not my kind. It's a horse ghost. Perisher was red in the face and lumbering along. Toes pointing down and not even clutching with his calves, not clutching with anything. Heaving like a sack. Stock all out of place under his ear, having a high old 7 and 6pence worth. Whoop. Went Mayday when the ghost made a pass at her. Sprung right across the road and the perisher fell on the ghost, farce ICDC. Serve it right, too. Real vicious horse that must have been that got killed there. To have a ghost like that. Why, you can't miss making a bit in that place. Every hiring fellow that comes down from London spins off at that haystack. You only got to sit behind it and pick up the bits. They don't all tip you though. Most do. This one give me 5. Here you are. Me pulled 2 half-crowns out of his pocket and handed them to Velvet in trust for them all. Thank you awfully. Me. I'll give it you back. Swear. And she hooked both middle fingers over her index fingers and held them up. National Velvet. 45. 99. Which is asterisk stuff, said me contemptuously. Keep your word and don't crack your fingers. And see this. Velvet, I'm a fool to do it. That piebald's as big a perisher as the fellow that tipped me the 5. I'm going up to look at him this afternoon and likely I'll be sorry when I see his murdering white eye. Can we come to? You got your muslins to iron. Muslins, said Velvet outraged. Your ma's just wrung em out of the suds. I seen em. For the fair. I'm not going to wear muslin, said Velvet with a voice of iron. You'll wear what you're told, said me placidly. I'll slip up after dinner. Nearer 1. I got them sheep at 12. Sounds as if I won't get any dinner. See Donald. Donald was beautifully dressed in a fresh striped blouse and grey pants the length of a coat cuff. The insides of both ankles were fastened up with sticking plaster, and his silver hair had just left the prongs of a damp comb. The brown of his arms was a mixture of coffee and silk. Hers the stinking ants, said Donald. What's that? A stinking ant just stung me. Where did it sting you? On my thumb, said Donald clearly, and held up his thumb. There was no mark of any kind on the pink thumb. Say stinging, said Mally. Ants don't sting. It was a wasp. Go on, said me. Don't be as old-fashioned. Heel. 46 National Velvet. Say stinking ant till he says stinging wasp. And it'll all come natural. Mally looked down her nose at Donald. You're soft. Me, she said. You been and killed something, Donald. It wanted to be dead, said Donald. A very little ant. Throwing the blame on the ant, said Mally. I thought as much. Donald made a pass with his foot. There's another one, he said. They all want to be dead. Nice excuse, said Velvet. Stop it, Donald. Every one of those ants, said Mally, taking a deep breath and blowing out her cheeks, has got an aunt and an uncle and little brothers, and this one hadn't, said Donald, and ran away. It's awful to be so pretty, said Velvet, looking after him. He's like a actress. Actress my boot, said Mally. He's a common murderer. Likes to see things stop, said me. Anybody's the same. You better go iron them muslins. Sooner you get them ironed, sooner you see the piebald. Be in towels yet, said Velvet. Mine was too short last summer. It'll look like a ham frill this. Got to get on, said me. Frittering my morning away. And disappeared. He won't go and see that piebald without us, said Velvet. What about the blasted muslins, said Mally. Better go. Here's Meredith. What's the matter, Mary? Went down the street, said Meredith. Looking at National Velvet. 47. Oh. The rook's nests. Dropped a splodge. A rook dropped a splodge. She was wiping her eye furiously with her dress. Gummy, she said. S gummy stuff. Get in under the tap, said Velvet. It's lime. Perhaps it's quick lime. Meredith ran blindly into the scullery holding her eye. The lime ran off at the touch of water. On the scullery ledge was a board with 4 objects on it like babies in long clothes, old bath towels, used for keeping the best washing evenly damp. Mally cautiously undid the first. It's them, she said, as though she had smelled a drain. What, said Meredith. Muslin, ducky, for the fair. Our muslins. Muslin, said Meredith, stiff with offense. Muslin, said Mrs. Brown from behind with a soft and heavy certainty. And your white woolly pullovers on top. You'll be warm and you'll be pretty. Get on upstairs and look over your stockings for holes. Stockings. We're not going to wear stockings. Mrs. Brown sat down on the scullery chair. We'll get it all over, she said. I'll run through it. You'll wear your long black Christmas stockings, with suspenders, fastened to them calico belts I bought you for the Christmas dance. You'll wear white petticoats that go with. Petticoats. Petticoats. That belongs to the dresses. Or should. You'll wear your muslins, and your pullovers, and your black lace shoes. Shoes. If you get a shock over everything. Velvet, you'll be. 48 National Velvet. Ill and you won't go at all. When you have muslins you have black shoes, and when you have black shoes you have stockings, or your heels rub. Edwina came through the street door. And you'll iron your muslins. Muslins are, said Edwina, in exactly the same tone as the others. We've been through all that, said Malvalia. Black shoes, black stockings, petticoats, suspenders, belts, pullovers. Perhaps you'd like to sit down and rest, Edwina. Go on, mother. We're to iron our muslins when father's at the bottom of this, muttered Edwina. Mrs. Brown reached for a long clothes baby and unrolled it. Damp yet, she said, trying it to her cheek. Soaking. They'll stay damp till the evening in the shade. You can iron them after tea. Go on and look over the stockings. Edwina, Malvalia, Meredith and Velvet passed through the little black door onto the stairs. The canaries were singing and shouting in the breeding cages, and the new wooden cage, recently put up by Meredith, hung insecurely and crooked from the nail she had borrowed. You got it up, said Velvet. It's all soft stuff in that wall, said Meredith. Nails going to come out, said Mally, and they pulled out the drawers to look over the stockings. Edwina held up her calico petticoat and measured it against her willowy figure. Dressed up in muslin one, she muttered. But I thought you liked dressing up, said Mally. Edwina made no reply. National Velvet. 49. Pound. J. Not dressed up enough is your trouble, said Mally. It's time one had. Murmured Edwina, preoccupied and searching in a drawer. Something more. And she found what she was looking for. I'll wear it over the muslin, she said, holding up a tennis skirt of white flannel. It's a bit yellow. I've got a blue leather belt somewhere. You'll make us look like a lot of dressed up babies, said Mally, half enviously. And mother won't let you. I'll slip it on last thing, said Edwina. Mother doesn't really care. It's father. The top'll look like quite a nice muslin shirt. I wish I could cut off the bottom. Well, that's your trouble, said Mally. My goodness, I wouldn't dare. Where's it kept, said Velvet. I had it in this bottom drawer, said Edwina. Velvet turned and stared at her. After a pause she cleared her mind. I mean the piebald, she amended. Oh, I meant to tell you all, said Edwina. They're going to raffle it tomorrow. We know, said Mally. Me said so. And he's given us 5 shillings to have a ticket each. Even Donald. Lent us, said Velvet. I meant lent us. Where do we get the tickets? They've got books at the post office. Books of tickets. Let's go down and choose early ones. Edwina stuffed her skirt back in the drawer. The stockings lay in tight black balls on the bed. 50 National Velvet. Come on, Meredith. You go. I'll come in a minute. Edwina, Mally and Velvet clattered down the stairs and left Meredith stooping beside a cage. Velvet put her head back in at the door. Shall I get yours or will you get your own? Meredith answered without looking round. The female's ill. Which is it? Said Velvet, coming nearer. Africa, said Meredith in a low voice. Africa had been a male until she had been discovered to be a female. Now she lay in the palm of Meredith's hand, cloaking her eye with a little sagging hood. Is it the heat? Said Velvet, awed. I don't know, said Mary. Get me the brandy. It's on the bottom shelf in the sideboard. In father's flask. While Velvet went for the brandy, Meredith reached for her fountain pen filler, her left hand groping in a drawer, her eyes steady on the faint yellow bird. Draw the blind, she said to Velvet, who had returned. Velvet drew the blind behind the roaring cages and all song dropped like a flag when the wind has failed. There was a sickroom silence and anxiety. How much? Asked Velvet. 1 drop. But Africa died. She died in the palm of Mary's hand without a sound or a sigh or a movement. She seemed to miss a little breath and go smaller, and Velvet, startled, glanced round, as though a whiff of life had drifted out of Africa. I can't hold her now, she's dead, said Mary, her teeth chattering. Take her off my hand. National Velvet. 51. Tip her off / said Velvet, wincing too. Goon. Take her, IFLL scream. Velvet took her and laid her with distaste on the bed table by Mary's bed. Horrible / said Mary. It's a corpse. Poor little Africa. She's gone away. I truthfully / said Velvet in a low voice, thought I saw her go. How? When she went small. Just something. What? Yeah. That was her spirit / said Mary suddenly, looking at her intently. Velvet and Meredith stared at Africa. I should like her just not to be here, said Mary savagely. I should like her to be all buried and finished. Perhaps me Wi-Fi. No, he won't. He'll say see bury your own bird. Mother will said Velvet. Wi-Fi she. Yes, come on. Leave it there. Velvet flipped up the blind again and all the canaries cantered straight into open song. Go on down to the post office and I'll be down in a second. Who's got the shilling? Mally has said Velvet. They'll be waiting for you. Don't get my ticket for me. No, Mary ran down the street. Mother said Velvet, opening the scullery door. Africa's died. Mrs. Brown turned. Mary no. Yes, she died in her hand. Just now. Where's Mary? 52 National Velvet. Gone down to the post office. But she can't touch Africa. She hates her dead. Could you bury her, do you think? She's on the table by Mary's bed. I'll see to her, said Mrs. Brown. Bring her down. I can't touch her either, said Velvet. She's... Mrs. Brown looked at her. You know when a thing's dead, said Velvet uselessly. Then after a pause she went slowly upstairs and brought down the dead bird in her hand. Mrs. Brown reached up to a shelf for a little cardboard box. She put Africa inside and shut the lid. Velvet raced down to the post office. In the sultry midday, with the hullocks steaming above them, a little group of parcel posters and stamp buyers was jesting over the book tickets. Edwina and her sisters stood in the shadow, their eyes grave and full of choosing. They were weighing the flashing, unequal importance of numbers. The blacksmith was having his joke. Stand up, gentlemen, he shouted, the horse is yours. Shilling a go for a mad piebald gelding. Or is it a stallion, Mr. Krum? Not clean gelded, eh? Thought as much. Mr. E'd done it on the cheap and left a chip. Not a bad thing to have a horse for a shilling, suggested Mr. Krum. You can always sell it for something. Not so easy done, said the blacksmith. You got to feed it and nod it meanwhile. E'd says it all right, quiet, said Mr. Krum. He says it will. Anybody know? I seen him ride it, said a voice. Went along quiet and dull. He had a basque asterisk on his arm too. And he opened. National Velvet. 5:53. A gate and let the basket fall. Never turned a hair. What's the matter with it that he wants to raffle it, then? He can't tie it up and he can't keep it in. He jumps any wall. Go sailing over the moon if you'd let it. Kink in its mind about being tied up or shut in. It's tired of catching it. Besides, he's afraid it'll do a damage in the village. He bought it cheap in Lewis Market, but it's no good to him. Some tickets were bought but there was no rush on them. Edwina walked out of the corner to the counter. The raffle book was 1 to 200, got out in ink hurriedly by Mrs. Ead. He'll likely make his £10 on him, said Mr. Krum. That's more than he paid for him at Lewis. Solemnly the four girls lined against the counter and gazed at the book. I've thought of 47, whispered Mally. But did you make yourself or did it come? That's what I don't know. I've got 10. Printed on my brain, large. In red letters, said Edwina. Silence. It's like a visitation, persisted Edwina in a whisper. Silence. But perhaps I'm meant to avoid it, she ended. Each girl stretched her mind and tried to tremble to the finger of God. I'll have 119 please, said Velvet unexpectedly and firmly to the postmistress. She paid her shilling, and the other three watched her, envious and dismayed. What did you? Began Mally. 54 National Velvet. I don't want to talk about it, said Velvet, low, and walked out of the post office into the street. The others followed her with tickets in their hands. We just took them anyhow, said Edwina, rather cross. Asterisk, what's the good of thinking, L? Have you got one for Donald? Number 1. Well, there we are anyway, said Mally. Let's go and pin them in the Bible. It's dinner time. Meredith instantly thought of Africa. As they walked back towards the house, Africa was like a yellow shade upon her mind. Where did she lie? Would she be visible again to the eye, or was she packed up forever? Mrs. Brown called to them from the door. Wash your hands quick, she said, it's hot dinner. I'll wash mine in the scullery, said Mary, and fled through the sitting room. Velvet whispered to the others, Africa's dead. Mrs. Brown turned off the scullery tap that Mary might hear what she said. Your little bird's buried, she said. Cage is all cleaned and I've put the cock in there. The greeny cock. But he's got no food or water yet. Run up and see to him. Mary turned with streaming eyes and kissed her. I'll rearrange them, she choked, and went upstairs to the bedroom. They sat down to dinner without Mr. Brown or me, and Mrs. Brown brought in the joint. Mary joined them, a little flushed, but peaceful. A squeaking and bleating came muffled through the wall. That's the last, said Mother. Father'll be in soon. Row those sheep make, said Mally. National Velvet. 55. Edwina got up to get the red jelly from the sideboard. We've taken 5 tickets, shilling tickets, for a raffle for the fair tomorrow, said Velvet. They're raffling that piebald. The piebald, said Mrs. Brown, he'd getting rid of it. Well, I'm not surprised. But what'll father? Time enough to worry when you get it, said Mrs. Brown. Got that jelly, Edwina? It's there behind the pickles. Where's Donald, said Velvet. Slip on. But he ought to be woke now. You get him. Velvet. Velvet got up and went out by the yard door. She pressed the spaniel's back with her foot as they struggled and changed places, smelling the joint. Jacob came wriggling and smiling round the wall. He was late in, having been down the village to the sea, watching the troopers unload from the charabancs. The whole day's heat was shimmering in the yard. The splendor of the heat stood upright like a tank of water. Dust moved in it and midges poured up and down. Immediately she faced the yard, Velvet went into a vision. The bones and stones and boxes and dogs of the yard dropped away below, and she was mounted on a cliff beside the piebald, on the hip of a cliff overlooking the sea. The sea was pale and a ship swam up in a haze on the sky. The piebald stared like a lunatic at the cobbled wall which bound his field. Velvet choked as she stared with him, and saw the grasses wave at the foot of the cobbles. The wall gave way as they cleared it and sank together, the sea rushing up. A gull's wing zipped and she saw the indigo shadow. 56 National Velvet. And with her knees she felt the ribs spring in arcs from the horse's spine. His boundless heart rushed into hers. The soles of her feet cramped against the impending waters. I've woke one, called Donald from the shade where he lay, on a mattress in Miss Ada's unused cart, its shafts propped on an upright barrel. Velvet crossed the yard and opened the little door at the back of the cart. Get up, she said, but the child only stared half awake at the sky. She took him by his bare legs and pulled. His shirt left his pants and began to turn up over his arms. Can't walk. Carry me, he said. His teeth chattered. I'm shivery, he said, and bumped his heavy head onto her thin chest as she struggled with him. That's only sleep, she said. It's dinner time. You've slept too long. Mary opened the sitting room door. Are you coming? She called. I've slept too long, moaned Donald at the door, in Velvet's arms. Get down and walk, said Mrs. Brown. Slept too long, he wailed self-pityingly. A little tap water and you'll feel better, said Mother. She took him and he wept a little and was carried away. He reappeared in a few minutes, bright and silky. I slept too long, he said in quite a different voice, engagingly, socially. Yes, we heard, said Mr. Brown, who had come in. Get up on your chair now. Here's your plate. The meat's sour, said Donald instantly, putting his nose to his meat. Pour out those sheep, said Mr. Brown. It's the National Velvet. 57. See. Drought. Bit rubby, weren't they? Me. Dog bin rice and said me. It's sour, said Donald, giving his plate a push. Mrs. Brown glanced over. He's got capers put on his. Take them off, Edwina. It's you that's sour, said Edwina to him, getting up and stooping beside him. Oh. Mother, he spat at me. Spit came out, said Donald, a little anxiously. Fractious, said Mr. Brown. Sit down, Edwina, and get on both. I heard Ed's going to raffle that piebald animal that got loose. There was no response. Everyone, thinking hard, ate silently. You ought to take a ticket. Velvet said Mr. Brown genially. We've all taken tickets, said Velvet softly, unable to believe her ears. Mr. Brown's face changed. He had meant to make a joke. He'll be meat if you get him, he said after a pause, and not genially at all. Velvet's face flushed faintly. Cabbage is stringy, said Donald, and created a diversion. He's possessed, said Mr. Brown vexedly. The condition of the sheep had annoyed him. Edwina and Mally cleared the plates and brought in gooseberry full. Velvet fetched the milk pudding from the oven. They started with fresh life on the fresh food. Want US afternoon? Me, said Mr. Brown. The girls grew tense, and waited, spoons still. About 5, said Mr. Brown, and the breath of National Velvet. 53. Anxiety was let out again, and the spoons moved on. The chairs were pushed in. F what we've received. Thank God L9, they said as one voice and fled. B. Chapter 4. The piebald cropped in just such a field, on just such a hullock as Velvet had dreamed. There was the haze, and the ship. Me, Edwina, Malvolia, Meredith and Velvet stood in a row leaning against the cobbled wall. There was a long and watchful silence. The wild thyme smelled warm and looked pink. The sea lay below, not blue but dove-grey. The coping of the wall was hot and rough. Stan's marvelous, said me at length. Another long appreciative silence. See his bone, said me. Me made a click with the gap in his teeth and turned to look at Velvet. What's that number of yours? 119. We aged there. What? You ought to have a horse eye. The piebald looked up and saw them. Stared. Then cropped again. Seems quiet forward / said Edwina. Ha. No emoing. Think he's more than 15 hands. Think he's more, said Velvet. See his white eye. They saw it. They saw everything. Their eyes, like birds' eyes, flickered over his startling patches of black and white. He was white in bold seas, and black in continents, marked in such a way that when he moved his white shoulders and his white quarters flashed, and 59. 60 National Velvet. His black body seemed to glide. Showy, said me. Velvet climbed the wall into the field. He'll be off, said Mally waningly. Velvet went among the hot grasses towards him. She knew him. She had already ridden him in her dream. He cropped, head towards her, but watched her coming. She walked steadily and straight and began to talk in low tones. He raised his head and looked at her, as firmly as she looked at him. She paused. He walked several paces towards her with confidence. No quirk or tremor or snort of doubt. See that eye, said me, hanging against the wall. They saw Velvet pat him and run her hand slowly down his neck onto his shoulder. She'll be that upset now, said me, if she don't get him. Velvet moved away. The animal followed her, flashing and jaunty. He had a white mane, a long white tail, pink hooves, a sloping pastern, and he struck his feet out clean and hard as he walked. Isn't his neck thick, said Edwina. Bit, said me. Been gelded late. The piebald, whose desires were gone, had kept his pride. He walked after Velvet like a stocky prince. Thick-necked, muscular, short and proud. He left her a few paces from the wall, and stood looking, then turned and cropped quietly.